The night it happened, he wasn't even home. He had been out before dawn, the way he always was, moving through the narrow streets before most of the town had opened its eyes. The air smelled the way it always smelled around him, thick, rotten, impossible to wash out of fabric or skin. His cart creaked along the cobblestones. His horse, old and slow, didn't flinch at anything anymore, neither did he. When he came back at midday, the house was gone, not damaged, gone. The timbers were still smoking. His neighbors stood at a distance, watching. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one of them looked sorry. He stood at the edge of what had been his front door and looked at the ash. His tools were in there, his few coins. The small wooden box his wife had kept her sewing thread in, years before she passed. All of it black and ruined. He knew why they had done it. He had always known this day might come. This is the story of a man who did a job that no one else would do in a time when that job was absolutely necessary, and who paid a price that most people today cannot imagine. His name was Thomas Grundy. He worked as a nightsoil man in mid-18th century England, in the years when industrial towns were growing faster than any city had ever grown before, and when the streets beneath those towns were rotting from the inside out. In the 1750s, across the cities and mill towns of northern England, tens of thousands of people were crowded into spaces built for far fewer. Manchester, Leeds, and Sheffield were swelling. New workers arrived every week from the countryside, drawn by the promise of factory wages. They packed into terraced houses, into rented rooms, into cellar dwellings with no windows and no light. Running water was a luxury that almost nobody had. Indoor plumbing, in the modern sense, did not exist. What existed instead were cesspits, deep holes dug beneath or beside houses where human waste collected day after day, month after month, until they were full. When they were full, someone had to empty them. That someone was Thomas Grundy. He was 41 years old when the house burned. He had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, the third son of a farm labourer. There had been no land for him to inherit and no trade for him to learn. When work dried up in the countryside, he had walked into Leeds with a few shillings in his pocket and no clear plan. He found lodging above a tallow yard, which already smelled bad enough that most men refused it. He found work where others refused it too. A cesspit contractor named Jeremiah Holt took him on at a rate of 2 shillings per load removed. The work was called nightsoil collection because by law it had to be done at night, between the hours of 10 in the evening and 5 in the morning, when the streets were empty and the smell would cause the least public offense. He had a wife for a few years. She died of fever in the winter of 1748. They had no surviving children. By the time of the fire, Thomas had been doing the work for nearly a decade. The process was exactly as grim as it sounds. When a cesspit reached capacity, the homeowner or landlord would contract with a nightsoil man or a small company to have it cleared. Thomas and 1 or 2 other workers would arrive after dark. They carried long-handled ladles, wooden buckets, and canvas sacks sealed with rope. The cesspit would be opened, usually a heavy stone slab or wooden cover set into the floor of a yard or outhouse, and the contents would be scooped out by hand, loaded into the buckets, carried to the cart, and hauled away. The pits were not just full of human waste. They held everything a household discarded underground: kitchen scraps, dead animals sometimes, discarded rags soaked in illness. The liquid at the bottom had often been sitting for months or years. The gas that rose from an opened pit could knock a man sideways. Workers learned to hold their breath and move fast. They learned to keep their mouths closed. They learned to keep wounds on their hands covered, because even a small cut that touched the contents of a pit was a risk that could end a man's life within a week. The full cart was taken before sunrise to the edge of town, where the waste was sold to farmers who used it as fertilizer. This was called nightsoil because it had value. Human waste was rich in the things that made crops grow, and agricultural demand for it was genuine. Thomas earned money on both ends, a fee from the property owner to remove it, and a smaller fee from the farmers who received it. He was, in practical terms, running a small business. He worked through rain and ice and heat. He worked when he was sick. He worked because if he didn't eat. What he could not work around was what the town thought of him. The rejection was not quiet. It was not a matter of people simply keeping their distance or avoiding polite conversation. It was systematic, and it was mean. There were taverns in Leeds where Thomas was not permitted to sit, not because of any written rule, but because the moment he walked in, other men got up and moved. There were market stalls where vendors would not take money from his hand. He had to place coins on the counter and let the seller pick them up after he had moved away. He wore the smell on him no matter what he did. He scrubbed with whatever soap he had. He left his outer clothes outside his door. None of it was enough. The smell came from inside, people said. It came from a man's pores when he lived in that kind of filth. Whether that was true or simply a cruelty people told themselves to justify their disgust, the result was the same. Thomas moved through his own town as if he were invisible to some and poisonous to others. His neighbors had tolerated him for years because they had no choice. He lived in a cheap street where people were too poor to be particular. But over time, a story spread, the way stories spread in small, cramped communities where fear runs faster than truth. Someone said they had seen his cart leak. Someone else said his presence attracted disease. A child got sick on the same week Thomas repaired a loose wheel on his cart in the alley behind his house. That was enough. They gathered the night he was out on a job, 3 or 4 men, and probably more who stood back and watched. They lit the thatch on his roof. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Thomas Grundy was doing work that kept those same neighbors alive. The cesspits beneath their houses, beneath the houses of the men who burned his roof, would have overflowed into their water supply within weeks if left untended. The drinking wells in mid-18th century Leeds sat just feet from the waste pits below the streets. When the pits overflowed, the water got contaminated. When the water got contaminated, people died, not 1 or 2, but whole streets. Typhoid fever moved through crowded towns like fire through dry wood. Cholera, which would devastate British cities less than a century later, killed through exactly this mechanism. The nightsoil men were not a nuisance. They were the only thing standing between an ordinary neighborhood and an epidemic. The men who burned Thomas's house were burning down part of their own protection. They just didn't understand that, or they didn't want to. Here is the part of this story that most people never consider. The nightsoil trade was not simply an act of desperation for men with no options. In the largest English cities, organized nightsoil companies became genuinely profitable enterprises during this period. The waste removed from London's cesspits was shipped down the Thames and sold in bulk to farms in Kent and Essex. Some contractors became wealthy men, wealthy enough to own property, hire workers, and move in circles well above their origins. They simply could not be seen doing so openly. They hid the source of their income. They did not host dinners or attend church in the parishes near their operations. The money was real. The social cost was kept carefully out of sight. Thomas Grundy never reached that level. He was a single worker on contract, not a business owner. But the fact remains that in the middle of a century, when most common labourers scraped by on near nothing, nightsoil workers earned wages that were meaningfully higher than factory hands or street sweepers. They were paid more precisely because no one else would do it. The market, in its cold logic, had assigned a price to disgust. Think about what that means. A society will pay a man more money to do work it finds repulsive, but it will not treat him with basic dignity for doing it. It will take the service, and then it will burn his house down. How far have we actually traveled from that arrangement? Look at the jobs that keep modern life functioning, the ones done in the dark, in the smell, in the cold, and ask yourself who does them and what we think of those people when we pass them on the street. A man in that kind of work, doing it consistently for 10 years or more, was living on borrowed time in almost every measurable way. The respiratory damage from pit gases was slow but permanent. Men who worked the pits long-term developed a distinctive cough that people recognized on the street before they even saw who was coming. The skin on their hands broke down from repeated contact with acidic waste. Eye infections were common. Gastrointestinal illness was constant, low-level, and grinding. Workers in the trade rarely appeared in public records beyond their 30s or 40s. They did not retire. They did not quietly move away to somewhere pleasant. They simply stopped appearing. Thomas stopped appearing in Leeds records in 1756. There is one brief mention of a Thomas Grundy in a charity hospital log from that year, a man of approximately 44 years, admitted for what the record calls a putrid fever, discharged after 9 days. After that, nothing. No burial record that can be confirmed, no property transfer, no mention in the contractor's accounts after that autumn. He did not leave a name on a building. He did not leave children who remembered him. He is, in the formal sense, a man who has been lost. What he left behind was cleaner streets, full harvests on the farms that bought his loads, and a neighborhood that went on living in reasonable health for years after he was gone. The same neighborhood whose men had stood in the dark and watched his house burn. Every city that grew through the 18th and 19th centuries grew because of labor like this. The wealthy districts with their fine streets and their low disease rates were protected, in part, by the nightsoil roots that ran beneath them. The public health reforms that came later in the 1800s, the sewers, the Clean Water Acts, the underground infrastructure of modern cities, were built on a foundation of what men like Thomas had been doing by hand for generations. The engineers who designed the great Victorian sewers were celebrated. The men who had emptied pits in the dark for 100 years before that were not mentioned in the speeches. That is the oldest pattern in the history of work. The people who make comfort possible are rarely the ones who get to enjoy it. The labor that holds a society together is most often invisible to the people that society honors. And when a man who did that labor became too visible, when his cart was heard too often or his smell carried too far, the community that needed him found a way to make him disappear. There are jobs in history darker than Thomas's. There are workers whose conditions were more physically extreme, whose social rejection was more complete, whose deaths were more certain and more rapid. Some of those workers never even had a name recorded in any ledger at all. They were paid in scraps, worked in total isolation, and handled things that would turn most people's stomachs before they could be described. Those stories are still out there, waiting.